Hello, this is Environmental Psychology, Part 10, Conversations about Offshore Wind. My name is Sean Duffy. I'm a professor at Rutgers, Camden. This series of lectures is part of a project that is associated with the New Jersey Wind Institute, which is a project that is out of Rutgers, New Brunswick. Now, what I want to do in this lecture is talk about some objections that people have about offshore wind. So for the past several months, I've spoken with people who live in communities near proposed wind turbine sites off the Jersey Shore, stakeholders in the industry, and even experts in marine biology. So I was able to learn a great deal about the kinds of things that people object to when they first hear about offshore wind, while also at the same time perhaps not knowing all that much about the topic. And so what I've really found are there's 12 most common objections. There's more, but 12 of the most common ones I just want to bring up in this series of slides that I have here. And so I also want to provide what I think are some reasonable responses to these concerns. So one common objection that people bring up is the idea of cost, that offshore wind farms may be very expensive to build and more expensive to maintain than other forms of energy production such as fossil fuels. And that may be true, that, a coal burning plant requires a lot less maintenance and upkeep than a farm of turbines that are operating in the sea. However, I think a good rebuttal to that might be that the cost of offshore wind energy have been decreasing over time and are expected to continue to do so as technology improves and economies of scale are achieved. In addition, the cost of offshore wind energy is expected to become more competitive with fossil fuels as the price of fossil fuels increases due to taxes and regulations aimed at reducing carbon emissions. But not only that, as it's evident by the fact that we have to go out into the sea in order to extract petroleum at this point. Accessing fossil fuels has become more and more difficult over time. It's not a matter of having onshore oil rigs. People have to travel with these huge rigs out into areas of, say, the North Sea or the Gulf of Mexico. And so it's becoming harder and harder to obtain these fossil fuels. As it becomes harder, that cost may go up as well. So it's not just the regulations that are at play, just economy and basic supply and demand play a role in this. And again, I think that it's often worth mentioning to people who raise this objection is the cost of not doing anything. The cost of inaction is extraordinarily high because one will have to deal with the fact that we will lose land, there'll be stronger storms, the economic impact of the habitat loss and the coastal loss is going to be so great that it will pale in comparison to the cost of installing offshore wind. A second objection is the visual impact. Some people often argue that offshore wind farms are unsightly and can mar the natural beauty of coastal areas. Now, I can understand this objection, from an aesthetic perspective, from, people who enjoy the Jersey Shore and they enjoy being able to go for a walk on the beach and not have these huge wind turbines in their face. However, I think that it's a bit of a myth to think that these wind turbines are going to be so close that they're going to be looming over the shore. The first wind project that's going to be installed is going to be installed some 13 miles off of shore. And I think it's worth reminding people that the horizon is only 2.5 miles in the distance. So when you stand at the shore and you look out into the ocean, you really can't see anything that's beyond 2.5 miles due to the curvature of the Earth. Now, of course, these turbines are going to be on pylons, so they're going to be sticking out from the sea. So it is possible that perhaps with binoculars one could spot them. But this idea that these are looming over the cities such as Ocean City or Cape May is kind of, it's just not accurate. However, opponents of offshore wind have produced pictures where it seems as if they are maybe a couple 100 feet off of shore, and that's just not the case. So I think it's important just to remind people that many offshore wind farms are located far enough from the shore that they're not going to be visible to people on land, and their impact on the visual landscape can be minimized through careful planning and design. Um, However, I mean, there are people that own boats and like to go out to sea, and if you go out towards these wind turbines, yes, they will become visible to those who are on boats or ships. However, I think that the idea of being on the coast, on the shoreline, and being able to have a strong visual impact of these, I think that that's kind of a mistaken idea. A third argument that you often hear is this idea of noise. Some people are concerned about the noise that offshore wind farms can generate, particularly from the construction phase and also from the operation of the turbines. So I've heard people mention that the wind turbine is as loud as a jet taking off. However, that's not quite true. Modern offshore wind turbines are designed to be as quiet as possible and have low levels of noise emissions, and particularly at distances greater than 300 meters, about 1,000 feet, from the turbines. Offshore wind farms will be located so far from land that they'll be impossible to hear at all. So this notion of hearing the something that sounds like a lawnmower or a jet engine, when something is located 5 to 10 miles offshore, it just won't be audible at that point. But this is a concern that people do raise. But I believe that in speaking to some people who design turbines, they're able to get them to be, almost silent to this point, or at least very low levels of noise from several hundred feet. They're not audible at all. Now, one of the major concerns that people bring up all the time is the effects on wildlife. So it's probably the largest concern. It's the one that you see spoken about in the news the most often, is the potential impacts of offshore wind turbines on wildlife such as birds or marine animals, particularly whales. There have been several highly publicized stories in the news about whale beachings in New Jersey. And a lot of individuals have attributed this to some of the ships that are doing surveys of the seabed, determining what are good places to place turbine pylons, and claim that it is the sonar that is causing whale beachings. Now, from my discussions with marine biologists, there's very little evidence that this is the case. There is evidence that the increase in marine traffic, and particularly in the size of ships, and the encounters between whales and ships, is one reason why we see deaths of whales. Another thing is that the marine biologists have mentioned is that because of climate change and the warming of the oceans, whales are now having to search out food in regions of the ocean that they were not used to traveling. And that may lead to an increased number of beachings. But yet another thing that you see is there just are, because of conservation efforts, there are just more whales in the sea. And given that there's more whales in the sea, you're going to see more whale beachings just by orders of magnitude that have to do with the size of the population. Just like in a large city, you're going to see, a greater number of people dying per day than you would in a small town. You're going to see when a population of whales increases to a much larger size, that there's just going to be more natural deaths that occur through this process of beaching. So I do think that one of the things that it's worth reminding people is that this climate change that's warming the oceans, that may significantly alter their ability to survive in this environment. And so if we don't do things that might change the situation of climate change, that might be an existential threat to the species as a whole. So I think it's worth reminding individuals that offshore wind farms can be designed and sited in ways that minimize their impact on wildlife, and the potential impacts of offshore wind farms on wildlife are generally much smaller than the impacts of other human activities such as fishing and shipping. Some of the marine biologists that I've spoken to have discussed the idea of whales being caught up in nets, the plastic nets or the lines that are used to catch tuna, which can be as long as 50 miles long. with hooks intermittently spaced. But, occasionally these lines break, and you have floating through the ocean these very large plastic lines that don't biodegrade, and they can be caught up in whales. And so, it seems as if other human activities other than offshore wind farms may be causing some larger problems. But on top of that, we don't see in those places where wind farms have been installed already, say, in off of Asia or off of some European countries. We don't see these spontaneous whale beachings there. And so it just seems as if this is something which people are catching on to due to the news media, but that there really isn't strong cause and effect relationship. Now, one has to also mention the plight of birds, because it is true that birds sometimes fly into these wind turbines. Now, there are things that can be done to improve this. One thing, incidentally, a designer of a wind turbine has told me is that if you paint one of the wind turbines a different color than the other, that's enough to sort of scare birds away from, flying into them. And it makes them want to avoid the area where the, painted wind turbine is. But you have to also consider that there are other things that are a greater threat to birds. The one that's the most significant threat to, avian life are domesticated and feral cats, who kill many orders of magnitude larger numbers of birds than do wind turbines. Now you have to think about this. Wind turbines aren't located everywhere. It's not like windows. I mean, birds flying into windows is, because windows are everywhere, a much more likely cause of avian deaths than wind turbines that are kind of in remote areas and are sparsely located. So I just think that's something that's often worth pointing out to people who object to on this, wildlife basis. Reliability. Some may argue that offshore wind energy is not reliable because it's dependent on weather conditions such as wind speed and direction. However, one of the things that we find is that in the area of the Jersey Shore, it's one of the better places along the coast for wind being constant. And so what you need is to have wind that's at least 9 miles per hour at all times. And that seems to be a condition that's satisfied by these sites that are off the coast in New Jersey. So offshore wind farms can be designed to take advantage of the most consistently windy areas, and advances in technology such as larger and more efficient turbines are making offshore wind energy more reliable. In addition, offshore wind farms can be paired with energy storage systems such as batteries to help smooth out fluctuations in wind speed and provide more reliable supply of energy. I mean, look, solar energy has similar issues because the sun is not out at 24 hours of the day. So you can only collect energy from solar sources when the sun is out. Hydroelectric energy can only be produced when there's water. In periods of drought, hydroelectric plants may have to shut down. I mean, in reality, if we are really looking for a energy source which is continuous and that doesn't contribute to climate change, really nuclear is probably the best option. But even nuclear plants the old fuel needs to be taken out and new fuel put back in. But I think that if we use a basket of energy sources, a combination of solar, nuclear, wind, and hydroelectric, we would be able to fill periods where there might not be as strong winds, and supplement that with these other sources of energy. This is how the transmission system is built as it is. It's why we, apart from the very infrequent blackouts that occur, that we have reliable energy 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So I think that this reliability issue is one that can be readily solved. Another argument is interference with shipping and navigation. Some people argue that offshore wind farms can interfere with shipping and navigation and, in that sense, pose a safety hazard. Well, that may be true, but these wind farms can be designed and sited to minimize their impact on shipping lanes and to ensure that they do not pose a safety hazard to ships. In addition, offshore wind farms can be equipped with lights and other warning systems to make them visible to passing ships. Now, This is a concern, and it also concerns military activity because other people have made the argument that it's not just container ships that get affected, but it's also military equipment that may be affected by the placement of these wind farms. But one has to remember that the shore, the ocean is very large. There's enough room in the ocean to have shipping lanes that most ships follow. That's the way that it works now. There are dedicated lanes that ships follow in order to minimize their impact on wildlife and to minimize their impact on striking underwater hazards and other kinds of hazards. So I don't think that this is going to be something which is a severe constraint on shipping. The ocean is large enough to allow for the ships that are out there and even more that probably will be enacted in the future. So as I said in the last slide, the interference with military activities. People have argued that offshore wind farms might affect military activities such as training exercises or the operation of military equipment. But again, offshore wind farms can be sited and designed to minimize their impact on military activities, such as being placed in areas that are away from military bases, away from airports. And military can work with developers to ensure that offshore wind farms are compatible with their operations. So this is something where I'm sure that this has been discussed extensively when planning these wind farms offshore, but it is one of those objections that I'm sure that the military and those that are installing these wind farms can resolve in a technological way through the use of technologies such as GPS and making sure that these are well demarcated with lights, so at night a jet might not run into them. Again, these are big. These turbines are big structures, but they're not at the level that most planes are flying at normally. So that's a concern that I think that can be readily dealt with. Now, another concern that people who live on the coast often bring up with me is the impact on property values. So some people may argue that offshore wind farms can negatively impact the value of nearby properties. Again, a lot of this has to do with the idea that these wind turbines are going to be directly offshore as opposed to being placed miles out into the sea. And what we find, though, is that research has shown that the impact of offshore wind farms on property values is generally minimal and may even be positive in some cases. In addition, the economic benefits of offshore wind energy, such as job creation and increased tax revenues, can help offset any potential negative impacts on property values. So one of the things that offshore wind can do, depending on how it's set up, is to subsidize other tax revenue bases. And so, to reduce property tax amounts. And there are a variety of ways in which this is being looked at. Again, there's no established policy yet on this. One of the other people that is going to do lectures like this is presenting on this issue specifically. So I don't want to go into great depth about it because it's outside of my particular wheelhouse of public policy. So, but in general, this notion that these wind turbines are going to be placed like on people's front lawns is just not accurate. Even if it is what proponents or opponents of the wind turbines might put in their brochures and their websites, these wind farms are going to be placed very far into the distance. Another objection is one concerning limited capacity. Some people argue that offshore wind is limited in its capacity to meet energy demand, and in part because it's dependent on the availability of wind. Now, on the availability of wind, I've discussed this a little bit before, that in areas off the shore of New Jersey are some of the best areas to actually harvest this wind energy. It's a relatively constant 9-mile-per-hour wind that's occurring offshore, so it's a really good place to put these wind turbines. But beyond that, what people often point out is the idea that these wind turbines, each one of them can maybe provide the power for, say, 1,000 or 1,500 houses. But look, that's not a lot of houses. You would need to have tons of wind turbines out there in order to meet and significantly reduce any energy needs. I've also had some people come to me, and this is kind of a common concern is that in other countries, the increase of use of fossil fuels offsets the installation of a wind turbine by only about 30 minutes. Now, I'm not sure where that statistic comes from, but it is a concern that people raise when discussing offshore wind. But what I think a good response to this is that offshore wind energy has a much higher capacity factor. The amount of energy generated compared to all the amount that could be generated if the turbines were operating at full capacity at all time than offshore wind energy. And the capacity of offshore wind energy is expected to increase as technology improves and larger turbines are deployed. In addition, offshore wind energy can be paired with other forms of renewable energy such as solar and hydropower to help ensure a reliable and constant supply of electricity. So I think that it is just the case that, um, you know, something is better than nothing in terms of action. Even if it is the case that these non-OECD countries are increasing their use of fossil fuels, every wind turbine is offsetting some of that. And eventually, again, other countries may follow our lead and develop their own offshore wind and other sorts of forms of renewable energy, because climate change doesn't just affect one country; it affects all of us. And so, to the extent that we're in this together, all actions that are doing something to reduce the impact is important. Now, of course, there are other concerns of a nature that even installing these wind turbines creates CO2. And that's actually a topic that's going to be discussed by another professor who's giving a series of lectures like this that I will link to in the module. But I think that it's important to keep in mind that as the technology develops, we'll become better and better at being able to reduce that impact and make it such that the net contribution of CO2 by the construction of these wind turbines will be very quickly offset by the reduction in the amount of fossil fuels that are needed to create them. Another common concern is impact on fishing. Some people may be concerned that offshore wind farms can interfere with fishing either by physically blocking access to fishing grounds or by impacting the populations of fish or other marine life. And again, a lot of people who live off the shore make an income by having boat tours where they bring people who want to fish, deep sea fishing, and will these wind turbines affect that? Well, as a response, offshore wind farms can be designed and sited to minimize their impact on fishing, and the potential impacts of offshore wind farms on fish populations are generally small compared to other human activities such as overfishing and pollution. In addition, offshore wind farms can provide economic benefits to local fishing communities through creation and provision of clean, renewable energy. One of the things that's worth mentioning is that, given that these wind turbines are going to require maintenance, people who have fishing boats where they're not using them for fishing throughout the year might supplement their income by ferrying people from wind turbine to wind turbine or otherwise being involved in this economic activity. But the marine biologists that I've spoken to have found that even in other countries where they've installed offshore wind, there has not been an appreciable impact on fishing. And in fact, there's been actually, for some species, the pylon bases of these offshore wind turbines provide a kind of a shelter or a habitat for some marine animals. So these wind turbines can be developed in such a way that it won't affect trawling. Trawling being the way in which certain mollusks are taken from the ground of the ocean. And these methods, of building these turbines can be done in such a way that these trawling ships won't strike, for instance, the cords that will be buried deep under the seabed that connect, each of these turbines. So that's one thing. The technology is there that makes it so that the impact on fishing will be minimal. Impact on tourism. Some people are concerned that offshore wind farms can negatively impact tourism by affecting the visual appeal of coastal areas or by disrupting the operation of tourism-related businesses. Now, I understand this concern. Again, it goes back to the fact that many people believe that these offshore wind turbines are going to be just a few feet off the shore, but they're going to be far miles into the distance over the horizon, and so there's very little visual impact that they might have. And some might argue that these wind farms might even create their own kind of tourism. People might want to go and see one of these turbines up and close. So, who knows? I mean, as I said in an earlier lecture, back in the day when the Ben Franklin Bridge was installed, people objected to it. They thought it was going to be this huge, ugly infrastructure project. Now people take photographs of themselves in front of it. So what is objectionable, right now, or in the minds of people who might be impacted by this, who knows in 5 or 10 years? The next generation of people who grow up, these will always have been out there in the sea. So for them, it'll be normal as seeing container ships in the distance that I'm sure that you see when you go to the Jersey Shore, or other kinds of ships that, pass in the distance. So I think that it's just good to remember that what at one point in time is considered objectionable and undesirable might at some other point in time be something which is aesthetically pleasing, or at least part of the normative environment in which people find themselves viewing. And then finally, the limited availability. Some people may argue that offshore wind energy is limited in its availability because it can only be generated in certain areas, such as along coastlines. But this is why we have a transmission system that is almost national in scope. It's not the case that the energy produced by these wind turbines are just going to affect those communities that are directly close to the shore. The energy that's produced, the electricity that's produced, will be fed into the grid, and that can affect people in a wide area. So we take advantage of the wind that's offshore, and it really positively impacts all of New Jersey and even beyond. And again, advances in technology such as floating wind turbines and making it possible to generate offshore wind in deeper waters in locations where it wasn't feasible. And so other forms of renewable energy, such as solar and hydropower, power, will help ensure a reliable supply of electricity. And again, it's important also to remember that we don't know what the future has in store for us. It's very possible that fusion technology, in which instead of atoms splitting as in nuclear power in the fission reaction, a fusion reaction by putting atoms together, that might be a technology that might make all of this mute in the future. We don't know that now. That technology is maybe 20, 30 years, maybe even more in the future. But it may be the case that these infrastructural projects will be a kind of a bridge between what we're doing now in burning fossil fuels and contributing to climate change to a potential future where energy is produced with zero impact on the climate. And in that sense, I think that even if wind energy is a stopgap measure, it's better than continuing along the path that we are doing, burning fossil fuels and increasing climate change and all the negative impacts that come with that. So, in summary, what I think that these 12 arguments, these are rational and reasonable arguments that people bring up. But some of them are based on misinformation, some of them are based on misperceptions, and I think that it's important for people to know that there are two sides to this. I personally believe that offshore wind is a very promising energy source for the future, but I do respect those who I've spoken to over the last 6 months who believe otherwise and really feel that passionately that New Jersey is making a mistake. I think that more research is needed. I think that we are trying to understand this better, both in New Jersey and at other universities around the country. And I hope that through more research, more education, we can come up with solutions that will be amenable to everyone, all stakeholders that are involved. So that's my 12 arguments. I hope that you enjoyed this and enjoy the rest of your day.